Hi everyone, next is about the chapter 5, part 2, theory-informed diagnosis of business problem. This chapter concerns the second step of the problem, the analysis and diagnostic step, and the problem has been defined after the first step problem definition as we learned before. And when it comes to the objective of the diagnostic, firstly, it is to validate the business problem and explore and validate the cause of consequence of problem, and finally, it is to develop preliminary ideas about the alternative direction to solve problem. And at the end of diagnosis, it must be convinced and able to convince others of the validity of the problem. About the characteristic of the diagnosis, it focuses on unique case, and it is not aimed at generating generic insight, and the research implies an integral perspective which constructs with theoretical problems that tend to become more specialized, and diagnostic research should prepare for redesign and change. And finally, the design of diagnostic research balance upfront choice and ongoing improvisation. And as you know, the diagnostic caused some difficulties, and this chapter is organized around 3 approaches that are helpful for producing a diagnostic. Firstly, it's focused on modeling business system and processes. Next is about problem-oriented analysis, and the final one is about the theoretical grounding. And next part.
Okay, coming to the next part is the business process and system. The collections informations on the system and process involved relate to the bigger pictures of where the problem occurs, and it also leads to the thing that would be able to investigate the problem. There are many different types of systems that can be the focus of analysis in business problem solving, but in general, they consist of interacting and interdependent elements. The organization as a whole can be considered as a system, and the most common way to map it is the chart of organizational structure. Some other common types of system include operational ones such as information system and HRM system, or strategic ones such as business models or ecosystem. Those business systems are not static. Instead, they are composed of different types of process, such as operational business process, which focus on the core of what the organization is about, or supporting process, innovation process, decision making, and etc. The process-oriented approach also can help analyze the business process into a background understanding of it. So it is important to map these process, the associated control system, and performance norm, as they are often associated with business problem. There are many ways to describe process and how they are controlled. An example is the set of integrated definitions of methods. After describing what we need to increase the description reliability of system and process, we can use member check. After the process has been described, we can do a quick scan by using a more problem-oriented approach and a cause and effect diagram for exploration and validation. So in conclusion, a thorough analysis of process and system forms the basis for further exploration and validation of the problem. If we just focus on the cause and effect only, the analysis will lack of grounding in the actual situation and produce a superficial analysis. By doing both of them, we can offer more insights and depths.
And the next part is the analysis of the business problems and its causes. And similar to most explanatory research projects, Design-oriented field problem-solving projects will involve empirical analysis, but different from others in FPS, the leading will be the business problem. The empirical analysis in this case is needed to validate the problem, specify the characteristics, explore and validate the causes, and lastly determine the importance. The analysis of the business problem will benefit from studying embedded cases, but it may depend on the problem you are encountering. We will need to consider the phenomena the problem is manifested. On the other hand, the three different aims of the empirical analysis may be executed in parallel or iteratively in the actual project. In validating the business problem, the first thing to consider in the diagnostic step is whether the problem is a real problem, a perception problem, or a target problem. We will need norms and evidence to identify which type of problem it is. Perception problem reflects the situation in which the owner has an inaccurate perception of the business system and performance, whereas target problem refers to a problem based on unrealistic targets, and real problems concern a situation that in reality does not meet realistic standards and not perception or target problem. And secondly, after considering the type of problem, we will check the validity of the problem statement, which sometimes it is straightforward. After that, we will collect factual information. Sometimes this may not directly available, and sometimes it can lie dispersed over documents and databases. In some cases, it is extremely difficult to obtain factual information to validate the problem. We will need to try building the information from the opinions of the organization members through interviews. And thirdly, we will compare an actual performance with a norm in order to determine whether the performance level is satisfactory or not. Norms can be selected from several sources, such as stated by the company itself in strategic plans, business objectives or standards, or by comparing our own organizations with others in the same industry, and lastly, or from scholarly literature. And we come to the conclusion that there will be different perspectives on what is satisfactory, or different interests, norms, or what is acceptable from different stakeholders. These will result in being careful on determining the scope of what is needed and feasible as solution. The more specific the problem characterization, the more effective the causes of the problem identifying.
Okay, so now moving on to the next part, we talk about the exploration of causes. After establishing the validity of the problem, we'll move on to investigate its cause, and we already constructed a cause and effect model that will be important input for the diagnosis, but usually at the orientation phase, it won't provide an overview of the potential causes that we will only need to verify. Additionally, we'll need to research to explore potential causes. When researching, we need to dive deeper, since we will need to identify the root problem which lies behind intermediate causes. As a result, we have found that a particular cause has a significant effect on the problem. We should explore the cause further. And the method for exploring, such as qualitative method, are usually more suited to identify the cause and effect. However, the respondent may be kept in the orientation mode for too long and result in producing superficial opinion. This is when we should map the business process first and then try to relate the business problem with the actual operation of the organization. This will result in more insights into the process and cause of the problem. We'll need to define and delineate the potential cause carefully. We'll form the basis for a systematic use of qualitative evidence, which can come from creating a coding scheme. It is beneficial if we conceptualize the causes mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. In this case, collectively exhaustive means that it offers a complete explanation of the problem when taken together, while mutually exclusive means it shows no overlap. So the conclusion for this part is the cause and effect diagram can have a recursive loop, which means that the effect of a particular cause may reinforce the original cause and create a vicious cycle. But overall, the cause and effect exploration will provide us the basis for the explanation of a business problem. So now we move on to the validation of causes. After identifying it come to validate the potential causes, we need to make sure that the cause is not inadequate in order for the proposed solution to be effective and productive. Each element and the relationship between them in the cause and effect diagram will need to be examined to make sure that the data is reliable and valid. This usually implies that we need to search for hard and objective data. So a typical problem we usually encounter is the lack of information. Since despite the amount of data in many organizations, the one we need may not be readily available. If there are no document or database, we can choose to create a quantifiable information through observation or survey. And the validation step can also be done through collecting and analyzing qualitative data. It's also possible to let people within the organization judge and come to the agreement for the cause of the business problem in order to realize what is the acceptable level of reliability. So the final step for this stage is to determine the relative importance of causes. Since not all causes are equally important to the problem and to not waste any resources, we need to select one or many that should be carried out carefully. We can also conduct a quantitative study to have a different opinion on evaluating each causes, given the improvement potential and problem. If the diagnosis revealed to be a vicious cycle, we can switch to stimulate the situation in a system dynamic model. Okay, so for the next part,
okay, so next we'll come to the theoretical groundings. So first, the diagnosis should be based on both the empirical and theoretical data analysis. And as a matter of fact, the empirical data and the theoretical grounding should go hand in hand and may iterate throughout the diagnostic research. So we will discuss how theory and scholarly literature contributes to a diagnosis. So it will depend on the project to decide whether to emphasize on theory or empirical data. And there are a number of ways in which the theory can be used, from a dominance of empirical to that of theory. But we should note that theory cannot be the sole source of diagnosis, but rather creatively and combine multiple perspectives. So first, for the literature as support, this is where we use existing literature as an extra source of evidence to validate the causes or sets of causes. And this is especially important when there are two particular factors are present, but when at the same time it cannot be claimed on empirical grounds that these two are related. And when this type of relationships have already been established in the literature, this can be the evidence for the same type of relationship, but in particular cases. So there is a note for this, as long as this particular case matches the context of the empirical study tested this relationship. Next, we come to the conceptualizations. The theoretical literature can provide the concepts to interpret the empirical phenomena, and as the cause and effect tree is likely to contain various non-theoretical factors, we can sharpen the analysis by translating these non-theoretical factors into concepts, and which will result in the cause and effect tree becoming more structured. And it will need creativity to interpret the problem in different theories, and this will result in discovering the necessary perspective that illuminates the problem. And the timing of conceptualizations is also an important factor to have the theoretical perspectives can guide the data collection in time. And as too late will mean the perspectives cannot guide the collections anymore, while if it's too early, the perspective will not give a clear usefulness. And for the conclusions, from using theoretical concepts that acquired from education, socializations, or professional literatures can help in conceptualizing the business problems. But on the other hand, it may exclude the other interpretations of the same underlying empirical phenomena. So we come to the next part.
For the alternative causes, existing literature can suggest alternative cause as long as it's reliable and valid for the practical situation. This is when a dependent variable in the study corresponds to the selected problem. The independent variables can reflect the causes of the problems. Besides the two requirements above, the context and literature selected should also correspond with the practical situation. some business problems, an existing comprehensive theoretical framework has already been available. An example is the overarching theoretical framework, which consists of main problem and several causes of the cause and effect diagram. So we are able to measure the dependent and independent variables from the scales that have been developed for the variables, and the result in the current value of variables reflect the empirical problems. So here are some notes. First is the theoretical framework must be valid for the practical setting. Second, although the framework in the example can also be solution concept, but for most problems and for most other frameworks, it will only tend to cover limited aspects of the problem. And last, the differences between an actual system and a literature model will never be the cause of the problem in reality. So we come to the conclusion. We should explore alternative explanations based on alternative frameworks or the basis of the preliminary cause and effect diagram, but in the end, we will need to select the most likely explanation or combine both and complete the diagnosis.
Yes, once the most important codes have been found, the diagnosis can be integrated into a diagnosis story, and the diagnosis story definitely become concise and integrated summary of the diagnosis in one or a few sentences. And the figures is an example of integrating diagnostic story, and after all, the only way to solve problem of a poor diagnosis is to spend more interrelating problems and codes with each other, structuring the list of problems into a coherent diagram of causes, symptoms, and consequences, and integrating this into diagnostic story. And next is about the alternative approaches, which conclude two types. Firstly, a quick scan. It may be applied when there is no appropriate cause and effect diagram at the beginning of the diagnosis step. And the first step is to identify the performance problem, and the next step is to identify a business system. And the final step of this is to analyze the findings, structure them into cause and effect diagram, and select a problem. Besides this, another type is opportunity-oriented analysis. The last part of this chapter, concluding remark from diagnosis to redesign. As you can see that the importance of developing and a complete, validated, and integrated diagnosis after this chapter. You should avoid attending the diagnosis phase for too long, maybe believing erroneously that a redesign will follow automatically from a diagnosis when you have enough information. In order to facilitate the transition to the design phase and to sharpen the diagnosis, you can explore redesign direction while engaged in a diagnostic step. And on the other hand, when engaged in the redesign step, the need and opportunity may arise to iterate and return to diagnostic mode for further data collection and analysis on specific issues. And this is about the chapter 5. Thank you for your listening.